I am racist, and so are you. When I make that statement, I don't mean it explicitly. I don't mean that you explicitly believe that we should judge people based on the color of their skin. You probably don't. But we still have this implicit bias. And you've probably heard that concept thrown around a lot. But I think in order to really understand it and understand how it affects your behaviors, you need to understand the mechanism. It's a thing that I firmly believe in, that if we're going to make any kind of changes in the world, we have to understand how and why these things exist to begin with. So I'm going to try to do the best I can to explain implicit bias and even the neuroscience behind it very, very briefly here. So in order to understand implicit bias, we have to understand where knowledge comes from to begin with. So when you hear a statement of any kind, Sally is pretty, okay? Just a general statement. When you hear that, what happens within your mind, and this is very, very simplified, but essentially you have neurons, right? These cells that are connected inside your brain. And when you hear Sally and pretty, there are neurons associated with those concepts. And as you hear that over and over and over again, those things fire together, right? You're hearing Sally and pretty, so they're going to fire at the same time. And there's this concept in neuroscience that is sometimes said that neurons that fire together wire together. So what happens is, in order to make our thinking as quick and efficient as possible, when you hear Sally is pretty over and over and over again, it gets easier for your brain to process that because the connection between these two things gets stronger. Okay, so the neurons, the neuronal connections actually get stronger between these two concepts. So even if you don't believe Sally is pretty, you don't believe that. If you hear it over and over and over again, it'll start to feel true. Because when you hear Sally, now suddenly there will be a very quick and strong activation of the concept of pretty. Okay? So even if explicitly you're like, no, she's not. When you hear those two things together, they start to wire together and become strong. Similarly, if you start hearing pretty, there's going to be an automatic activation of Sally in that category. So how does this then relate to implicit bias? We live in a world that was founded with racial bias. Obviously, we know that as American citizens. We know our history. And some of that has persisted. We can see it in cultural references, in stupid jokes that people make. As we hear these things over and over again, even if explicitly we say, well, that's historical, or, well, that's a funny joke, they didn't mean anything by it, still, we hear those concepts repeatedly together. And so two concepts become associated, so that when we hear one, we have automatic activation of the other, even if we don't believe it to be true. Okay, so this has been shown in lots of studies with things like really, really mundane materials like doctor and nurse, right? That when someone hears the word doctor and they need to respond to the next word that shows up, they'll respond much quicker if it's something that's closely associated with it. So we do know that these things do affect behavior. Now, as far as implicit biases go, there's been some work with the Implicit Project out of Harvard that shows that these connections that we make, these implicit connections and these implicit biases, do affect behavior, but to a somewhat small degree, okay? It's a small effect. The problem is, and they say this directly on their website, the problem is that if you take those very, very small effects, perhaps, but you multiply them times the thousands of behaviors that we engage in a week, right? And you multiply them times the millions of people who are engaging in behaviors, well, now you start to have a real problem. Because even if you only were to make an actual behavioral judgment based on this implicit association 1% of the time, Well, now out of 1,000 behaviors, that's 10 racially discriminatory practices. And then times millions of people in the world, that's a lot. That becomes a systemic problem. So, how do we fix it? I wish I had an answer. Obviously, there's not like a clear answer to this question, or it would be fixed by now. But if we understand the mechanism, it gives us a little bit of an answer of what to do about it. So if what's happening is that we have these associations that are not necessarily something we chose, right? These are things that we've just heard out in the world that are creating these associations for us. How do we counteract that? What do we do? So one possibility is to try to replace those associations, right? If you've heard a racial group with something negative repeatedly, well, now if you try to wire something positive to it, that'll replace it, right? Yes and no. That's really, really hard to do. To try to take a lifetime of hearing discriminatory things said to you without your choice, and to try to replace them with a lifetime of good things is going to be really, really challenging. It's worth doing, but it's going to be challenging. The other mechanism here would be to not put the negative things there in the first place. Now, for you and I, it's too late. But for our children, it's not necessarily too late. They are going to be out there hearing some of this stuff, but we can try to protect them from cultural references, from stupid jokes, from all of those situations where these associations could be made. We can try to make those associations not made. And similarly, we can try to create positive associations by using diverse children's books and diverse programming and diverse friends, right? That if they have all of these positive associations, they are much less likely to have the same implicit biases that were handed to us and handed down from generation to generation. Lastly, work on explicitly fighting against the implicit bias, right? So we can explicitly know that these implicit things are bad, but that means that when we are in situations where an implicit bias might be an issue, reviewing applications, for example, instead of ignoring race, it probably is affecting you, and you probably should pay attention to the fact that you have an implicit bias in that situation so that you can fight against it. Because ignoring it allows the implicit bias to come into play. Trying to say it doesn't matter allows the implicit bias. But instead saying, I am explicitly rejecting this as a factor in my decision may help. I hope that this helps some to understand what's happening inside your brain, the fact that it's happening without your awareness. It was given to you without your permission. But this is the mechanism for why these things exist and how they do affect our behavior as they sort of fly under the radar. I hope that helps. I hope together we can learn to make a better world for the next generation.